Foundation. So with me here today, there are amazing speakers, and it's Ignacia Uribe from the Veg Foundation. She's a founder of Veg Foundation. She studied journalism and has a master's degree in animal law from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. She worked in media in her country and she wrote a book. So give a warm welcome to Ignacia. And there's Jacob Peacock. He's a research assistant at Stanford University and research manager at Rethink Priorities, focused on farmed animal advocacy. His work has examined international informational interventions to reduce meat consumption, like documentaries, classroom education. You might have read his research about price, taste, convenience, and he's ready to speak more about it. So give it up for Jacob. And it's Chris Bryant, PhD, director of Bryant Research, a think tank working with alternative protein companies and animal protection nonprofits to accelerate the protein transition, as well as the head of policy at the Alternative Proteins Association. He's also very knowledgeable about cultivated meat, because that was the topic of his degree. So give it up for Chris. Okay, so I'm very happy to have all of you here and speak with you about our theories of change. So I think it would be the best start if you could all go through what you do more in depth than what I could have possibly said in one sentence. You're experts in that field, so please, can you tell us let's start with Chris. What is Bryant Research? What do you do? What's your role in supporting plant-based advocacy? And also, tell us, where did your interest in cultivated meat come in? So, a bit about you, theory of change, what you do.
Yeah, thank you very much for the nice introduction and for the warm welcome, everybody. So I run a company called Bryant Research, which does social science research for the protein transition. So we do polling, focus groups, and we do sort of policy and economic white papers, and it's all focused on meat reduction and alternative proteins. We try and make our content very relevant to the current debates and talking points that are relevant to our movement. So, in recent times we've written about ultra-processed food. We have a piece called The Ultra-Processed Myth, which gets into some of the reasons why processing is not really something that you need to worry about with respect to food healthiness. We have a piece recently talking about farming jobs, the big kind of narrative around vegans are destroying farming jobs, right? You see, farming jobs have gone down, but meat production's actually gone up, so it's not the vegans' fault, right? And we have a few different bits on our displacement as well, and perhaps most notably for this panel, a response that I wrote to Jacob's research for Rethink Priorities about the general importance of price, taste, and convenience. And Jacob and I have spoken about this a little bit. I think our material disagreements are not as not as material as they might first seem, but we certainly come from quite different starting points or assumptions, perhaps. But yeah, I'll look forward to getting into it a bit more today.
Great. And Ignacia, tell us what are the fields and interventions that you have in Veg Foundation, and what is your role specifically in that organization? I think we all want to learn more about what you do in such an area as Latin America.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for being here. In Veg Foundation, we work in Latin America to promote plant-based diets. So right now we work in 5 different countries. Chile, where I am based, is our main country probably. But we also work in Mexico, in Colombia, in Peru, and Argentina with some interventions. We do mostly corporate and institutional work, but we also do some challenge. We have a plant-based milk week twice a year. We also have a veggie challenge. And those works for the whole continent, for the whole time, because we all speak Spanish. So that's very good. And me, myself, I I kind of do a little bit of everything. Well, I wrote a book about this last year, so I promote through the book. I try to get into different fields that normally we don't have the opportunity to be in, like other type of conference or libraries or presenting the book in different cities. And also, well, in the day-to-day, I work with the team, of course. I strategize with them. And at the same time, I do a lot of lobbying and networking in different fields in the country to try to get more opportunities for the plant-based sector.
Great. And Jacob, can you tell us, for those of you who haven't read your research, maybe briefly what it's about, so we are all on the same page, and what are the main takeaways? What is your understanding, where you come from, of what is the price, taste, convenience theory? Could you tell us more about that?
Gladly. Oh, am I on? Great. Yeah, so I work for Rethink Priorities, as you mentioned, also working for Stanford. I'll actually be moving over to Stanford for most of my time at the end of the month and leaving Rethink Priorities. But one of the big pieces that I wrote in my time at Rethink Priorities was on plant-based meats specifically, maybe alternative proteins more generally, and especially addressing a very common theory of change that I sort of termed the price, taste, convenience theory, which very roughly speaking goes something like, perhaps if we could get plant-based meats, so your Impossible burgers, your Beyond sausages, that sort of thing, if we could get them to prices very similar or below their animal-based counterparts, and then we could also get them to taste the same, in some sense, as their animal-based counterparts, and then finally get them to some level of convenience, whether that means availability, like they're in all the same stores and all the same places available commercially, or as well as the packaging and the preparation. And if we could match sort of all the levels between plant-based meats and animal-based meats across these three categories, something important would happen. What exactly that is a little bit underspecified in my opinion, and that's going to be a recurring theme here where what is the PTC theory? Is a bit of an open question. And certainly in response to the paper, some folks, no one came running to clarify what the theory was, I'll put it that way. So instead there's a lot of ambiguity of what it really means for something to be PTC equivalent, and more importantly, what we think would happen if that were to occur. In my opinion, I think the general narrative of the PTC theory was something along the lines of, if we could reach parity across price, taste, and convenience, we would expect a really large sea change, a rapid shift where most people would stop eating animals and start eating that plant-based meat instead, mostly on the basis of those three factors, with the idea that that is really what drives food choice. And those are kind of the big three. Once you get them done, people will basically just switch, and it's a done deal. So that's broadly speaking my perspective on the issue. In terms of what I wrote about in the paper was largely debunking this theory or opposing this theory, and specifically the idea that this would be a really massive shift. I think there's one incorrect takeaway is the idea that, I think, all proteins are a waste of time, and that's not the case at all. I do think all proteins have real potential to have some impact for animals and reduce the demand for meat and other animal products. Instead, the idea of a rapid sea change and a really large majority of people switching over, certainly in the current climate with current consumers, mostly focused in Western countries, US and Europe, that's not so likely. That's probably not what's going to happen based on a couple different lines of empirical evidence, starting just at the theoretical level. There's not really the sort of direct support for the theory that price and taste and convenience are kind of the key determinants of food choice. And then working through a couple different lines of evidence that suggest even if you tell people in sort of hypothetical scenarios, like imagine you're choosing between PTC equivalent plant and animal-based products, what would you choose? You really don't see a majority of people saying that they would make that choice. And then finally, in some real behavioral settings in universities, in one particular university where they tested this, or in some observational situations in certain retail chains like IKEA or other restaurants, we see, again, just not that massive shift, but instead a small chunk of consumers moving from one to the other. And similarly, we have to contend with the fact that some of these consumers would have been eating plants anyway. So that's maybe a quick summary of the paper.
Great, thank you for elaborating a bit on that. So yeah, we've gathered here in this group, and the topic of the conversation is theory of change, because Jacob's paper, I think it was like very a bit divisive, but also like opening to like new thoughts in the like plant-based advocacy for like many people probably. I found it very interesting, and I find it very interesting to have this conversation now, because Chris wrote this article with his perspective on Jacob's article. So I think that's going to be like a very interesting exchange, as well as Chris is a specialist in the cultivated meat. So looking into the future, I think that this might or might not play a big part in our future, and in our theory of change we need to either think about it or like discard it, or like keep our options open, as well as Ignacia, who works in quite a different area to Europe, to US. So I think your perspective will be very useful in terms of understanding how we can work in different areas of world. And with that being said, I'm very curious to know what are your predictions for the future of the food system. I think it's a good like starting point to see what do you see in both 5 years and then 50 years. How will it shift? What would be the role of, I don't know, different innovations? Will it be plant-based or cultivated meat? Or maybe not that much of a change will occur in your point of view? Hopefully that's not the case. But yeah, I want to hear from each of you. What is the view for 5 years? What is the view for 50 years? Ignacia, maybe can you start?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I think right now we are living in, well, probably you all know, but like the plant-based industry is facing like a big challenge. Many companies are having less sales, and also, I don't know if you know, but Beyond Meat, for example, the stock has gone like very low, the stock price. But I am kind of optimist, and I think probably in the next 5 years, like we will see that this again rises, I hope, because probably it's because during the pandemic we have too many plant-based products like going to the market, and not all of them were good enough to the public. And now if you go, like, okay, it's true that many plant-based companies have shut down, but at the same time, the good products still on the market. So I think it's kind of part of the, yeah, like part of the life of the products. And I hope in 50 years, I hope cultivated meat will be the thing, like the norm. And there is also a big part of people that don't want to eat that kind of meat that's still on the plant-based sector. But I think cultivated meat, and I don't know if Chris, if you agree, but yeah, I think we have in very good products in the plant-based sector, but we still have seen a lot of people that don't want to shift. So I think that might be the answer, cultivated meat in the next 50 years.
Thank you, Ignacia. And Jacob, what is your take?
Yeah, so 50 years is a long time, very, very hard to forecast, and I'll be the first to admit I don't have the quantitative, probabilistic forecasts that I'd prefer to bring to the table quite yet. But broadly speaking, I've pretty low confidence on the cultivated meat side. I think the technical barriers there are really, really quite significant. When we're talking a 50-year timeline, I think it's hard to imagine a world in which cultivated meat makes a lot more progress relative to plant-based meat. So to get cultivated meat to where it needs to go, if you will, by which I mean relatively reasonable prices, not necessarily price parity exactly, but relatively reasonable prices, scale, that sort of thing, were major technological breakthroughs. And I think some of the people who are most informed about this have really strongly put forward the view that there are just some huge technological barriers here for cultivated meat as a product. So it seems likely to me that if in 50 years we're breaking those sorts of barriers, then we would also be just making massive progress for plant-based meat similarly. Which then brings us to this question of like the interplay between the two. Now, the most extreme kind of perspective on this that I personally don't find very credible, but on the other hand is, I'll say, the party line from some like pretty leading folks in the plant-based cultivated meat space, is the idea that plant-based, right, animal-based meat is just made of proteins and lipids and carbohydrates, and so are plants. So we can just rearrange those plant proteins and lipids and yada yada and make that into animal meat. And then cultivated meat, that just is animal meat. But then, of course, you get to this like sort of equivalence here where all of these are the same thing, quote unquote. So I think if you kind of follow that line of reasoning, these end up like fairly indistinguishable, and then it doesn't really matter which one's which because they're all animal-based meat. I personally don't find that line of reasoning terribly credible. There's a reason why we need a huge amount of technological breakthroughs and very expensive engineering to make all of these products end up tasting like animal-based meat. And there's lots of attributes of animal-based meat that we won't aim to replicate as well. So this brings us to the last question, right? Thinking about the technological side is one thing, but where a lot of my work is focused has been on consumer acceptance as well. And there's a big question for cultivated meat around consumer acceptance. Like a lot of, for example, like Chris's work has reviewed a lot of the consumer acceptance literature, but much of it, remains in the hypothetical realm. Ultimately, if you ask people about what they'll do hypothetically, they're quite willing to say yes to a lot of things. My favorite example is that like if you poll people in the United States, you can find like 5 or 8% of people who support taxes to dig potholes into the roads. Presumably this is not really their sentiment, but that's what they'll say in a survey. So we get to this question of cultivated meat, what are the advantages over plant-based meat? I think probably triggers more food neophobia, so fear of new things, like a sort of Franken meat sort of perspective on average. We get to the question of, will there be separate enough segments of people who wouldn't just be eating plant-based meat instead, and instead will only be affected by cultivated meat? And I think it's possible that ends up being a relatively small sliver in terms of impact there. So that's maybe an uncultivated and plant-based products, and maybe I'll skip over the rest of the food system, but I think there's lots of important things to be said there as well in terms of the trajectories of like aquaculture and wild capture fisheries and insect feed and all that. But I probably said enough, so.
Thank you, Jacob. And Chris, what's your point of view, especially given that, we have different views on cultivated meat? I'm curious to hear yours.
Yeah, thanks very much. It's a super interesting question. I mean, I think, 50 years is a long time. So all of these questions are very important, and there is a correct answer regardless of what any of us say, right? We might all be wrong about these things. There is a fact of the matter as to whether cultured meat's ultimately going to be technologically feasible. If it is going to be technologically feasible, it makes sense for the animal movement to be putting resources, money, and time into developing this and supporting it. If it's never going to be technologically feasible, we should stop doing all of that like yesterday. So it's important, the answer to that question. And likewise, when we're talking about price, taste, convenience, I opened that response to Jacob by also saying, if it is the case that these factors are not very important for food choice, then we should pivot our resources and do something else and stop putting money into plant-based meat development and so on. Now, actually, that's not Jacob's view that it's like unimportant to that extent, and I think that was part of something that we clarified through that process. Exactly. So I think that Jacob's view was somewhat misinterpreted by some people, perhaps as saying like there's nothing important here, these factors don't matter, or we shouldn't continue developing alt proteins. That's not Jacob's view. Now, when it comes to cultivated meat, and I'll put a bow on that, I do agree with as well a lot of what Jacob said about I think those factors, price, taste, and convenience, are probably necessary but not sufficient. And I saw a couple of people on the forum saying that as well. Where, yes, if you have very good alternatives for people to go to, it makes it easy to then nudge them over. And if you don't have very good alternatives for people to go to, advocacy is a lot more difficult because you're asking people to make much more of a sacrifice, basically. Likewise, if you do have very good alternatives, but no one feels particularly urgently that they need to change their diet, then they'll just never bother, right? So I talk about push and pull factors, where you'll have pull factors being alternative proteins pulling people towards these increasingly tasty and cheap and healthy and everything else products, and then push factors, which like animal advocacy, giving people a reason why they need to stop doing the current thing that they're doing. So I think you need both parts, basically. You need very good alternatives for people to take up, and you need very firm messaging. And I am quite a fan of, I think it's effective to use animal cruelty messaging. Maybe that's something that's sometimes contentious. I'm looking for potential areas of disagreement as well as I talk. On cultivated meat, honestly, I am not the person who has a good understanding of all of the technical aspect of this and the science beneath it. My specialty has been on the social elements of this and looking at consumer acceptance and to an extent regulation and things like that. But I will note that there was a couple of years ago, there was an article that did the rounds. What was that? The name of that outlet? It was basically the article that
Counter?
Yes, yeah, the Counter. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. That basically kind of said, cultivated meat is likely never going to be technologically feasible. This can't scale. Like, give up, basically. And my understanding, I'm sure Jacob will correct me if I'm wrong, that a lot of the objections posed in that piece were subsequently blown out the water in the next couple of years by cultivated meat companies who did, in fact, surmount those insurmountable barriers. So I do think this is an area where there is exponential progress, and it's very difficult for anybody to predict where it will go next, right? It might be in 50 years that cultured meat is doing nothing, but that in 52 years is everything, right? So it really could be that kind of like exponential progress, which is hard to predict. And from what I've seen, it's very much vibes-based, because like I said, I'm not the person who has a detailed technical understanding of all of this. In fact, nobody does have a detailed technical understanding of the whole process. And so, yeah, am I right on that many of the claims in that counter piece, those barriers have been surpassed?
I actually hadn't heard that. I don't know, I don't dispute it. I don't know the answer. I'd be a bit surprised. I mean, it depends on the particular barriers too. I would think that Dave Humbird, who wrote the underlying technical report that the article is based on, I think if they were really blown out of the water, they'd be bandied about and they're really beating him over the head for this. But perhaps I could have missed the article where this all happened.
Yeah, I think there's so much of because as well so much of the technology is proprietary. The most advanced stuff in cultivated meat is happening like in cultivated meat companies and not necessarily in university labs with things that get published and stuff. So we actually don't know like a lot of the state of the art, right?
Yeah, I think that's like probably roughly true, but my sense is that, and perhaps we should like jump from this since neither of us are like super expert on it. My sense from reading David Humbird's work on this is like, yeah, some of the technological barriers are just really, really high, and there's potentially internally, like some of these companies do have just much better tech than they're letting on. But on the other hand, like we would expect to see more payout from that if that were the case. Whereas like, my impression is like one specific technical bit that I am familiar with is like on the cell culture side, there's this issue with roller bottles being the main mechanism for cultivating cells and growing up cells, and they're basically like individual bottles that are rolled back and forth to grow cells in, very labor intensive, not scalable, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the major meat companies was kind of putting forward that like, oh yeah, we've like progressed way beyond this, and we've got our bioreactors running, which is sort of the dream here, is these like massive brewery style vats, as they sort of term them. But in practice, that wasn't really the case, and they're still mostly using roller bottles that are a lot less scalable. But I think we should probably follow up on this and figure out what the actual fact of the matter is, because I didn't know that.
Okay, but staying on the topic of cultivated meat, since we are discussing it more in depth, what do you think are the biggest obstacles in making it actually accessible? Because of course we have the law, the entire thing of getting it even to the market, and especially in Europe, which is a bit tougher to get stuff allowed in Europe. And also your specialty, Chris, is the normalization of the topic. What you did the research on was the perception of cultivated meat, which we already talked that it changes and it's kind of tricky to measure. But what do you guys think are the biggest obstacles nowadays? You, Jacob, also don't think it's realistically gonna be a big alternative. So Chris, maybe you can start, but to hear.
Well, technical points aside, yes, you mentioned legislation. That's increasingly a worry. I think that in the last in the last year, let's say, certainly in Europe, where you've had the farmer protests and bringing their tractors out in Brussels and everything else.
In Poland too.
Yeah. The meat industry lobby did a fantastic job of putting all of the blame for the cause of that onto alternative proteins, and so now you've got we've got farmer protests, so we better ban cultivated meat. It's not really anything to do with the farmers' problems. None of Italian farmers' problems have been caused by cultivated meat. But that was, the opportunistic response. And you see similar things in some of the states as well, right? Florida has a cultivated meat ban, supposedly, and some other countries in Europe are looking at that as well. It's a very dangerous situation. There is populist sentiment against cultivated meat, and it's very much there's a good paper showing that anti-cultivated meat sentiment is correlated with conspiracy thinking. So, no surprises which side of the political aisle in the States that kind of sentiment is coming from. But yeah, definitely it's kind of correlated with those other forms of political beliefs. And it seems that basically the meat lobbies have been quite successful in corralling that sentiment and translating it into some political wins. So, the bans on cultivated meat, to the extent that they've happened so far, are not science-based. It's not that there's been an assessment of the product and it's been determined that it's unsafe or something like that. No, not at all. It's 100% political. There's no scientific basis for that. So I think that's a real threat. And, we talk about the regulatory process, and it's going to take a long time to go through and be demonstrated that it's safe and so on. But actually, in some places, not even going to get the chance to prove that, just because people think it's yucky, so that's that. So I think that's a real challenge at the moment. I'm somewhat optimistic about attitudes shifting in the right direction in the future. I think it is pretty huge. The Singapore approval of cultured meat several years ago, and you've been able to buy cultivated meat in Singapore since 2019 or 2020. It's a very small amount and it's a very high prices and so on. But I think it's very important for the vibes that has happened, and that we can say, this is a thing and it's been approved here for 5 years already and so on. So I think that's a good point to take on that. As to anything else we can do sort of productively to push back on that, I think it's good to know and to point out to people who are talking about the bans, these are 0% science-based, right? This is entirely vibes. It's entirely in response to the farmers' protest, which is completely misguided as well. So I guess that's a good a good talking point on the ban so far, right? 0% science-based bans.
Jacob, what's your view of the biggest obstacle? The technological part, or?
Yeah, I think the technological barriers are still quite high, but maybe more interesting to talk social policy side as well, because I think there's is an interaction effect, right? Like as we've seen, if we ban cultivated meat, we won't even have to worry about consumer acceptance. But unfortunately, I do think we've kind of got layers of barriers here. As you said, Chris, yeah, these are not science-based bans. This is just certainly from the U.S. perspective, it seems like just total slam dunk politics for the right and the Republican Party here. It's just like, great, our supporters hate the new Franken meat. Done, banned. Our farmers like it, our supporters like it, and there's barely an industry to care. So, slam dunk, huge win for us. So I think that's like in a really unfortunate situation. But this parlays nicely into some of the challenges for the PTC theory, which has a little bit of a libertarian bent to it, right? It's this idea of, it's just going to compete on price and product attributes, and the free market will take it from there, right? Because that's what people care about. They care about price and whatnot. And I think these sorts of bans are a pretty clear repudiation of that, is that consumers didn't care about the technological opportunity of cultivated meat. They cared that it sounded icky, and it was new and weird, and someone said it was made from cancer. Which, all these things are just like pretty preposterous, but they work great, and they have nothing to do with price, taste, and convenience. And to the credit of like GFI, for example, they've more recently pivoted to talk about the health, the importance of health equivalence, for example. But that said, that was after the fact, whereas these sorts of attacks were absolutely telegraphed. I think it was in 2017. Richard Berman, who's like pretty much the best like supervillain I think that the U.S. has probably internally, is just like this guy who's gone from tobacco to climate change, just helping these industries like run the same fear, uncertainty, and doubt playbook. He literally broadcasted an editorial, which was basically just an advertisement for his PR firm in Meeting Place that we all read. And I was like, hey, price, taste, whatever, who cares about that? Just tell people it's unhealthy and that it's like gross and poisonous and like, replicating cells sounds like cancer. I don't think he wrote the cancer bit at the time, but I wouldn't be surprised if he's the person who thought of that idea for the current press cycle. So this was 100% telegraphed that this was going to be the approach of the industry to fight off cultivated and plant-based meat, for that matter. And I think that was an oversight for the movement that we kind of pushed ahead on our PTC theory, when in fact, not surprisingly, health matters as well. But even beyond all of that, the facts don't matter that much politically. It's just not important whether plant-based meat is or isn't healthy. It's whether people think it's healthy. And it's not important, or as important, whether it tastes the same as a hamburger or not. It's important whether people like the product and they like the idea of eating an Impossible Burger. And go into this a little bit more in terms of taste testing and what it means to be taste equivalent. But I'll pause there.
Yeah, so for Ignacia, I am curious to know whether in Latin America there is a different perspective on cultivated meat, because I know it's very culturally also dependent on how we view food, and also there are many different legislative barriers that are different country to country. We already talked about how laws are passed differently in like federal countries like US or some countries in Latin America, and how it works differently in Europe to like get food approved by European Food Safety Commission, like compared to US. So like what's it like in your area?
Yes, I agree that legislation is one of the biggest barriers, probably. We already have a cultivated meat ban in Uruguay, for example. They already ban it, so no one can produce it. And for example, in Chile, maybe to have the approval would be easier, but the problem is that the political sector, even if the consumers are not against it, the political sector is very linked to the land in all Latin America. So many politicians come from farm families, or they get money from farmers to their political campaigns. So, for example, in Chile, we have an Ipsos survey about how many people would like to see cultivated meat marketed and made in Chile, and almost 50% of people in Chile or Chileans agree that they would like to see it. But in the other hand, right now we are fighting a bill that is trying to get all food tech companies, which means not just cultivated, also plant-based, for example, that use artificial intelligence and everything, be labeled as simulated food. So yeah, it's crazy. So yeah, we are working and trying to not get that bill passed, but it's very difficult because, as I told you, like, the political sector is very linked to the land. So many of them, even from different sides, not just the right. Some people from the left side or left parties also agree. So I think one of the main barriers, and also I see like as a journalist, I see also like a huge communication challenge, because just like 2 or 3 years ago, we were still debating between calling it cultivated or lab or clean meat. So we just like said, okay, cultivated is the word. But I think it's very easy to attack this kind of innovation, because we haven't done any campaigns to people acceptance. So it's very easy to say things like the ones that you said, like, oh, it's yucky, or it's linked to whatever, cancer. Or so I think we also lack in communication, especially in Latin America. And also another thing is that these type of innovations are made by like very small scientific startups, and we haven't seen yet like a meat company, as we saw with the plant-based sector, like a meat company getting into this. I think that will also make a huge change.
And is it like similar with plant-based food? Is it like new, or what's more traditional food in Latin America? In country to country, probably very differently, and you work in such a large area. But I'm curious to know what are the differences of working there compared to what other animal advocates and plant-based advocates do in US or Europe.
Yeah, I think with the plant-based sector, I think the main challenge is cultural in Latin America, because every country, well, we all speak Spanish and we share kind of a culture, but every country is very different when we talk about food. For example, I don't know, like what we eat in Chile is not the same of Mexico or Colombia. So most of the innovations and products that we get are based on the things that you already develop in the US or in Europe. So for example, we have a lot of plant-based burgers. And I think that is also a challenge, because for someone that, I don't know, like eats taco 5 days a week and then turns vegan and has to eat burgers 3 or 4 times a week, probably that person will stick to veganism like 1 or 2 months, but we don't have yet like the solutions for every country. And I think that's a main challenge, because I think plant-based burgers are awesome, but are awesome especially for the US, not for Latin America, for example. So we are not, like we need to develop our own solutions in that market.
Okay, and like, do you find different intervention working in Latin America that maybe it works in Europe or in US but doesn't work in different countries in Latin America, or the other way around? You do it something differently?
Yes. For example, we have this veggie challenge of 30 days. And once we work it in a group that I know it's doing very well, for example, in Europe, and they do Facebook groups to support the participants. And I think it's like very good, and it works really good here. But for example, we try it, and no one uses Facebook right now in Latin America, like just like my mother. So, and people that sign up were like 24, 25. So we couldn't find a way, because we thought about, okay, maybe we do it by WhatsApp, but probably you need like a TikTok group or something like that. So we weren't able to keep doing the support groups, because we saw, I don't know, like if, I don't know, 5,000 people sign up in a month, just like 500 get into the group, and then no one interacts. So it was very difficult. So yeah, I think the cultural challenges are different. And also we have this patriarchal culture also in Latin America that is very linked to meat eating. And I think that's also a challenge, especially for older generations.
I understand. We've been doing like plant-based challenge in Poland, but we stopped. So like, don't worry about the Facebook groups. There are other places. Yeah, I'm really excited to hear, Jacob, what have you been like working on and updating on the price, taste, convenience theory? Because preparing to this panel, like I read your research a year ago when I was right before I was hosting a panel on care as well, because it just came out like a day before the panel, so we needed to like touch briefly upon this topic because it was all new. And it's been a year, so since then you must have had some interesting conversations about that and some interesting like new developments, as well as I think that the discussion in the forum on of effective altruism, like I read that preparing to the panel, which was a lengthy read, like 3 hours long, or even more. So yeah, there was some interesting pushback about how like, yeah, what you pointed out is interesting, but not like most of the people who do stuff related to price, taste, convenience don't view it as just like black and white of if we have the price, taste, convenience, parity, all of that, people will just start buying plant-based food. It's more than that. It's just like a starting point. So I'm very curious to know what's new.
Sure. So, very interesting response to the paper in general, and this kind of, I'll call back to an earlier mention I made of this idea that the price, taste, convenience hypothesis is a bit underspecified. And I was aware of this in writing the paper because a lot of the times when I wanted to find like, you know, the quote that really captures a proponent of this idea, it's not necessarily out there, and you kind of have to piece this together. And if you watch like talks from people who've talked about price, taste, convenience equivalence, they don't actually outright say a specific claim. It tends to be more along the lines of like, factory farming is a bad, massive problem, and like more and more animals are killed every single year. Alternative proteins could change the world, and price, taste, convenience equivalence would make an exponential rise and change of everything. But they don't, you know, the two aren't actually directly connected. It's sort of implicitly connected. So unfortunately, and I think this is a real downside for the discourse, a lot of it ends up being a little bit of a vibe, right? Of like, what do people think? What do they claim? And personally, I think this led to a little bit of moving goalposts over time. For example, like way back in 2017, there's some pretty direct quotes where folks are saying things like, you know, price, taste, and convenience are 99% of food choice. They basically determine food choice. So if you hit those three, then this is what happens. Is the implication, right? If that's what you believe, that those three things determine food choice, the logical implication then is that if you can match the products, people would shift from one to the other, given some motive perhaps, or if you're maybe slightly below on price or something along those lines. So overarchingly, I think that was one interesting update, was just how underspecified the hypothesis is, even getting down to the nuts and bolts of like, what is price equivalence? This seems very, very obvious. It's like, well, if a sausage is $2, then the plant-based sausage needs to be $2. But actually, the world is a bit more complicated than that, because sausages aren't fixed at $2, right? They change prices all the time. And then by the same token, does that mean like plant-based meats need to change price in lockstep with animal-based meats? In which case, this is like a very weird specification of like, oh yeah, we need to like constantly change the price to always be the same, or does it just need to be like the lowest it's ever been, or like will be in the next like 6 months? That's like quite ambitious. And this all like depends. Like some people think that price differences are like really, really salient, and it's really important that, the plant-based meat be $1.99 if the animal-based meat is $2. I personally think that a lot of consumers' price is just not that salient. Oftentimes, the units are different. It's going to be a 1 pound of this product versus, I'm in Europe, 1 kilogram of this product versus 0.9 kilograms of this other product.
Yeah, because pounds, we would not understand what it is.
Exactly. So those price comparisons aren't actually that direct in practice, and oftentimes, chicken is really, really cheap, and people aren't like, oh my gosh, I'm spending €3. I'd like to save 10 euro cents on this. Like, gosh, that's not really the logic that most people are going through necessarily, in my opinion. And there's some empirical evidence to support this view as well. So that's maybe number one. Is this is really underspecified, and then sort of following from that is that a lot of people have tried to rehab the theory, but I don't think that can really go very well if you don't, you're building on a shaky foundation. And it's like, oh, yeah, sure, price, taste, convenience is not enough. We also need health. We also need health equivalence. And you run into the same issues here. Health equivalence is incredibly demanding. Nutrition science is super difficult. We like barely have an idea, the most basic questions in nutrition science are hotly disputed. Really difficult to do. So if you add the condition of health equivalence, it's like, how are we ever going to verify whether that happens? It's incredibly difficult to figure out whether, a particular ingredient causes one of 1,000 different symptoms or syndromes or outcomes that can happen 50 years down the line. And to show that these two products are health equivalent in some sense is incredibly demanding. And then that leads to this problem where if that's your hypothesis, that if PTC plus health were satisfied, that's going to be very hard to verify, and then we're kind of having a pointless debate, right? If we can't falsify the theories that we're putting forward, it's quite pointless. So I think that was another update for me as well, which is just like how shaky the foundations are here. And I had added a section to the paper addressing this as well, because convenience is another great example where incredibly demanding under some definitions. If convenience means every shop and retailer and food service provider has a animal-based and a plant-based version, that's like a whole other supply chain. That's incredibly logistically demanding. And we're envisioning a very different world under those conditions, right? If we were to get to a world where every single food supplier had equivalent products for plant and animal-based meats, that would just be a really different world, and would have so many other factors that would be dragged into achieving that sort of level of convenience. So that was certainly an update for me in terms of the whole vagueness of the PTC theory. Another really important point that I made a correction to on the paper a couple weeks after it was published was on one particular study that I cited. Excuse me. One of the most direct tests of plant-based meat to date at the time, which was the study at UCLA, University in Southern California, where they had added a Impossible ground beef product to their dining hall, and then they had a control dining hall to compare against, actually two control dining halls to compare against, and then they studied the effect of adding that Impossible ground beef and running a bunch of other climate campaigns and motivational to motivate people to eat that Impossible beef. So they tried to study the effect of adding that and running the campaigns. And in the paper, I had thought that these were fairly close substitutes to other meat products that were available there at the cafeteria. And in fact, that wasn't the case. It was a bit further away. There's like a cubed steak, and my, as an ignorant vegan, my knowledge of like steak and beef products is not as deep as you might hope. So there's like a cube steak and like a shredded beef, but none of those are quite ground beef. So that was something that I changed my mind obviously on pretty quickly after the paper is, okay, this trial is not quite as close on taste as you might hope. But that said, I do think the trial is still pretty relevant, even though it didn't nail taste. It wasn't exactly a taste equivalent. We do know from the trial that the students found the product good enough in some sense, right? Maybe it didn't taste exactly like the other beef products available, but it's possible that it tasted exactly like ground beef, for example, even though ground animal beef was not on offer. And a lot of the students purchased the product and chose the product in, I say purchased, they actually didn't have to pay for it. They paid for the whole semester all at once. But in any event, they chose that plant-based beef pretty frequently. I think it was like 5% of transactions for all the dining halls that were studied in the study, so including the control dining halls where it wasn't available. And despite buying lots of plant-based meat, we just didn't see that concomitant fall in the products that you would expect to then decline, which would be like the beef products potentially. And this gets to like a central point, kind of my third area of updating is on the actual question of, okay, price, taste, convenience, that's interesting and all. But another question you could ask is, currently, with the products that we have now, when they go in the market, when a restaurant starts stocking ground impossible beef or a new plant-based meat burger or shredded chicken product, whatever, when they start selling that, what happens? What's the effect on animal-based meats and how much displacement actually occurs, right? Because at the end of the day, that's what we care about. It's really nice to sell plant-based meat, and it's good for the industry, the plant-based meat industry, to sell plant-based meat. But in terms of animals, what matters is how much less animal-based meat is consumed. And this is another really key point that I had emphasized in an earlier draft of the paper, but I think is a point that I've emphasized in my work elsewhere, that we really need to focus on displacement and meat reduction, how much actual less meat is being consumed, not just selling more plant-based stuff, whether it be plant-based meat or other like more traditional plant-based foods like beans. And the update there is that across the relatively limited literature that covers displacement, the picture is not great, in my opinion. And Chris, we might have some disagreements here, so maybe this will be interesting. But there's some studies that find like effects, but relatively small effects, and oftentimes you might sell, let's say, 10% plant-based meat, but then only get like a 3% animal-based meat reduction. So the kind of ratio of displacement is not 1-to-1 as you might hope, but instead quite a bit smaller. And in general, it seems like not that much displacement is happening, and the studies seem to be either at like zero effect or just relatively small effect. And this ranges, there's lots of different approaches to studying this question. So there's some studies where you actually can manipulate, say, by like promoting a plant-based meat in a grocery store and getting more people to buy it. So this is kind of nice because rather than just like observing what happens, you actually increase sales of the plant-based meat and then see if animal-based meat sales fall correspondingly. And in the studies that have done this so far, that generally doesn't happen, or it happens very, very slightly. I think those are probably some good updates.
Thank you, Jacob. And Chris, this is the fist fighting moment we've all been waiting for. So go ahead.
Standing up.
Yes, Karolina invited Jacob and I think, hoping we would have much more of a punch-up than we probably will in practice. But nonetheless, we do have some productive disagreements, so that's good. I'll start on the displacement point. I do think that there is some good evidence that there is displacement when plant-based meat is purchased, that it's diminishing the demand for animal meat. I think there's a couple of studies I can point to that show some interesting things on that, but a first thing that I would appeal to is it would be a remarkable waste of millions of dollars in lobbying against alternative proteins for the meat industry if they didn't think that alternative proteins were somewhat going to be displacing their demand, right? So clearly the other side thinks that there is a displacement effect, or at least thinks that there could be a displacement effect. I'll say as well that any study where it's kind of narrowly construed, like we did, when you bring plant-based meat into this grocery store and how does it affect over kind of a 12-week period or whatever it may be, is going to miss like the bigger picture of, well, maybe these products get normalized and then over time they kind of make up more of the demand and so on. There are a couple of data points where there is some evidence of displacement going on. And this will be an interesting one, actually, because I think it leads into like one of our broader differences in approach. So there's a study that actually Jacob and I worked on together before we fell out. No, I'm only joking. Where we had asked people in the UK various different questions about their attitudes, meat consumption over time. We asked them at the start, then 6 months later, and then again 12 months later. And we had a variable which was the change in meat consumption and the change in plant-based meat consumption. So however frequently they said they were eating it at 0 months and then at 6 months, like what was the difference between the two. So you have this change in consumption variable, and we found that they were significantly negatively correlated. So if people were eating more plant-based meat, they were likely to be eating less meat. So there is some evidence to this point. There's another study that I'm sure Jake will have seen, which is about milk displacement. I think it's in Canada with the almond milk displacement. And that one found...
Slade or...
Yeah, I think it might be Slade,
okay.
yeah. And that one, my reading of it was there was quite... It seems to be quite bullish on displacement in the kind of results section, but then he gives lots of caveats and says, oh, it might, there could be other stuff going on. But I think it was something like a 0.6 correlation between the two. It was quite a strong dairy consumption going down over time in Canada and plant-based milk consumption going up. And then they kind of have the discussion section where they say caveat, there could be other things. People have breakfast less often these days and stuff like that. I think that's all fine, but sometimes I worry that in like research in general, people can take the caveats like too much. Do you know what I mean? Like, it could be the case that there's other things going on. Canadians are just drinking less milk, and it's not as robust evidence of displacement as it seems. But it's still pretty decent evidence that there's some sort of displacement going on. And so I think that there's, sometimes in research in general, we end giving all the disclaimers and the caveats, but that does, it should moderate your confidence maybe in the results, but it doesn't say that this is irrelevant or not happening. I think that's often something that we're kind of like too nervous to reach conclusions which probably are correct, given some caveats and so on. But yeah.
Great, thank you. So going from that, I was curious to know what are your thoughts about the direction that we should take as a plant-based advocacy movement, right? Like animal rights movement, but like directed to the transformation of the food system. Given Jacob's critique, given the state of cultivated meat, other innovations, and in general, what we are now allocating our funds in, do you think it's allocated well? Do you think we should focus on something a little bit different? It's an open question to all of you, so whoever feels...
Yeah.
Wait, do you mind if we talk a little more displacement, just because it's my personal interest?
Go
ahead.
So Chris, like totally some points of agreement here, which is to say, right, very broadly speaking, in terms of research designs, we have like on the one hand our experimental designs, which are probably the most familiar. If you've heard the term like an RCT or a randomized controlled trial or a clinical trial, these are your study designs where the researcher is very directly in control of the intervention or the thing that you're trying to test. So, in a clinical trial, of course, you say like, okay, I'm going to flip a coin and decide whether to give this patient a given drug or not and see what happens. Or in our case, you might say, I'm going to flip a coin, and that's going to determine whether this week we put out the plant-based milk in this grocery store, or we might have 100 grocery stores and we'll do plant-based milks or plant-based meats in half of them and not in the other half. And these are experimental designs. And then, of course, the other side of the coin is your observational designs, where we're just going to look at 100 grocery stores and see over time when their plant-based meat sales went up, did the animal-based meat sales go down? So that's broadly speaking the divide here, and I totally agree with Chris. Sometimes people are a bit too hard on the observational studies, and there's a lot of caveats to be had, but that doesn't mean that they're always wrong. But that said, yeah, I think I maybe come down a little bit harder on observational studies sometimes, and I'm more inclined to defer to experimental studies at times as well. Milk is a really interesting chestnut of a topic, especially in North America, where fluid dairy milk, so like liquid, like dairy milk in a jug, or a pouch if you're in Canada, it used to be like a real mainstay of consumer demand, and people drank a lot of milk. They just had glasses of the stuff and put it in cereal and all that. Whereas culturally, that's really shifted a lot. And I do think that in terms of running observational studies on milk consumption and the displacement question is just very heavily confounded. For example, the study you're referring to is looking at national aggregate demand. So fundamentally, all the data they have is like fluid dairy milk go down, plant-based milk go up. And by those lights, like, I think it's pretty hard not to be like, oh yeah, that must be displacement. But in practice, that means you're not looking at the possible confounders. And in both Canada and the US, we can see like a long-running trend of less and less dairy milk consumption. And then later on, plant-based milk consumption comes up as well. But there's like a pre-trend there, as they call it. So before the plant-based milks really got very popular in the market, there's already a big slide in dairy milk. And that's what makes me more skeptical of those sorts of observational studies on dairy milks.
Yeah, that's fair. No, that's a good point. What do you think of my appeal to the other side? Like, it'd just be a great waste of money for Richard Bergman.
Yeah, so I think like this kind of gets cut into by some of our earlier talk about like cultivated meat, for example, where this is like, and I had a really interesting conversation with an ag economist at one of the land grant universities, which in the US is like very interesting system, we'll say, where there's universities that are pretty much explicitly charged with, or they're explicitly charged with like, help out your local industry. Like you do research to make sure that like the dairy industry makes a lot of money. That's your job. And the best part is when the New York Times cites them like a neutral party, like, oh, don't worry, we just asked the dairy department. They're scientists, and they say that this is happening. But in any event, I do think a lot of that lobbying comes down to, I agree, there's certainly an inference, right, that this could hurt our industry. Like that is indisputable to some extent. But on the other hand, plant-based milks are just a really interesting example. U.S. dairy is fascinating little niche. A lot of the big U.S. dairy companies have plant-based milks. They sell them as well. And they just own dairy farms and they sell plant-based milk. So the groups that are lobbying on this, I think oftentimes this is less of like because they have observed displacement or have really strong evidence of displacement, and instead is like, yeah, our members, our local farmers are hurting. Dairy farming in the US is terrible, like gig. You lose a lot of money. It's very risky and really squeezed economically. They're hurting and they want us to do something. And this is easy, popular wins is like, you know, lobbying to get plant-based milks stamped with a big red label that says like almond juice or something. So I think some of this is like more politics, and we shouldn't interpret it too strongly as like evidence towards displacement specifically. And the other piece is that I think we tend to assume the industry is a bit more sophisticated than it tends to be. And of course the industry is huge, very heterogeneous, and I'm sure there are very sophisticated parts of it. But oftentimes they're very unsophisticated. And like I've another interesting observational displacement study from Plant-Based Foods Association worked with a major grocery chain in the United States, and one that actually is like on the more like they run their own in-house analytics firm. So they're among the more sophisticated marketers and analytics folks. And it's actually the Kroger Analytics that wrote the report, and it's like not very good. Like the analysis has like a lot of really fundamental issues. You know, if it was published in like a clinical epidemiology journal, like it would never get published. Like all the peer reviewers would be like, this doesn't make any sense. Like, why'd you design it like this? And just like misses a lot of the basic observational science and methodology things that you would expect for an observational study. and then get some like really bizarre results consequentially, where it's like, oh yeah, the people who like ate the most plant-based meat like had the least displacement, and like when people went from not eating plant-based meat products to eating plant-based meat products, that was like the smallest effect, and then the people who went down, that was like the bigger effect. Like all these like really paradoxical effects, and this gets like mostly methodological issues. But I think both illustrates the point that like the industry is not always that sophisticated.
Yeah. Last thing I'll say on displacement, because I know you want to get to some other topics.
But I love displacement.
I know, yeah. This is why I say I think we like sometimes come from different starting points. My assumption would be that there is displacement. Here we have like products which are designed to be very similar, and the sellers on the other side trying to stop them from being sold. Now, if there are studies which seem to suggest that there might be displacement, but there are problems with those studies, I'm like, well, I would start from the assumption that there is displacement and want to see evidence that there's not, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think that's like a very Bayesian thing to say, right? It's like kind of my prior view on this is X. And I'll freely admit more inclined towards equipoise, which is like the idea of, we should start from not sure 50-50 and figure it out from there. But yeah, we can end it here and jump to the next question.
I think it's very interesting. It would be cool to have more data, as in if we knew how much is actually selling, where it's like mostly not like public information. From what I tried to do in like my research to my degree, like back a few years ago, it was hard to find. So
really difficult. But
yeah.
Don't worry, I've got 2 studies in the pipeline.
Oh, awesome. Coming back to the, but first, if you have any questions, head to the inventory and ask them, because we will do some questions if you have them. So just reminding you of that. Coming back to the point of the direction of the plant-based advocacy movement, what do you think about what's happening right now? Like, are we focusing too much on the price-taste parity, or are we focusing too much on, I don't know, corporate work or legislative work? What do you think? It's like the direction. Is it good? Whoever wants to start.
I can start. We also work in the animal welfare side, and we can see the difference. I think we, as the plant-based or diet change movement, are less articulated than the animal welfare movement. So I'll say that we need more articulation between the groups, and probably have like 1 or 2 asks that we work on like all together. Kind of that happened some years ago with the Meatless Mondays, for example. And I think we did it also in Chile, for example. And when you show the policymakers that, I don't know, like so many countries have done the same before, it's easier to convince. But I think as a movement, like in the plant-based sector, we lack of this coordination between like all the stakeholders in the movement. So probably we need to work more in like movement building first, and try to get to 1 or 2 asks that we all agree that are the path. I don't have them, but I think we should work on that.
Yeah, having a direct ask, and I think like building. It's necessary to build the momentum and to build the interest and urgency in people. So that makes total sense.
Yes. And it's stronger if we were all together in the same, like, let's say, I don't know, like, let's get all public institutions to be 50% plant-based, for example. If everyone is working on the same, and then you have some wins somewhere in the world, like those wins also, they just not help only the animals in this side of the world, like they help all animals, because they serves as an example to other countries to do the same.
Yeah. Awesome. So do you have something to add, Chris, Jacob?
Yeah, for sure. So I think there's a couple of things which I would say it would be easy for us to get wrong. So one is on all proteins and one is on messaging. But actually, before I do that, I want to say, Ignacia, in case I didn't get the chance, I really love the Latin America advocacy stuff. I think it's likely very, very effective. And I was telling you about this the other day, but for the benefit of everyone else, Argentina and the US, the per capita meat consumption is about the same, roughly like annual per capita meat consumption. But the cost of living and advertising and employing advocates in Argentina is maybe 1/10 of what it would cost in the US, right? So that seems like a very impactful thing. There's other like big arbitrage. I think another one I compared with Spain and South Korea, where social media advertising is like 20 times more expensive in South Korea than in Spain, and they have, again, pretty similar meat consumption, right? So it does seem like there's some parts of the world are just much, much better value, right? Dollars spent to meat consumption ratio in terms of doing advocacy. So I think it's really cool that you're working on that.
Thank you. Yeah, and also it's interesting because we produce a lot of the meat that is consumed in other places in the world. Like we export a lot of our meat. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So on the things I think we could get wrong, the first is on messaging, and I think that hopefully this is reassuring to lots of people who do the animal messaging. I see lots of people saying you shouldn't talk about animal cruelty, it's going to put people off, it's going to give people cognitive dissonance, and so on. I think that's like a half understanding of the role of cognitive dissonance. Anyone who's been a vegan advocate or even just talked to family members and tried to have that argument will know about cognitive dissonance, where people will realize their behavior is not in line with their beliefs, and so now, in order to fix that, well, the most common thing in a vegan debate is to subscribe to some silly belief, right? And this is how you get people saying, I'm actually not sure if chickens are conscious, but I'm pretty sure that lettuces are. It's like, okay, is anyone going to say they believe that if they're not having a conversation about veganism? Like, probably not, right? So that's one effect that we see of cognitive dissonance, and we can get the idea that, like, okay, if I sell something people contradictory to their beliefs, they're just going to, like, confabulate some silly belief. That does happen. Most of the time even, and certainly in the moment, right? It's very, very rare that you'll have an argument about anything with someone and they'll say, yep, right now I was right, you're wrong, right? That never happens, right? But that is only half the story with the cognitive dissonance, because of course the other way of resolving that dissonance is to change the behavior. And I think that everybody who is now a vegan who used to not be a vegan will have had to go through some period of cognitive dissonance. I certainly did before I went vegan. Had a period of thinking, do I really have to do this? I'm trying to come up with good arguments against it, right? So I think that cognitive dissonance is an important stage. We shouldn't be scared of giving people cognitive dissonance. It doesn't mean that we're pushing them away. It's a step on the progress, right? So, and the evidence I've seen to put a bow on that point is compared to environmental appeals for meat reduction, animal cruelty-based appeals are going to have a higher proportion of people saying they'll change their diet, more substantial dietary change, say for example going vegan rather than going flexitarian, and maintain that change for a longer time. So really the animal message and giving people the things that they don't want to see. People won't want to see this, it won't make you popular, but it will make vegans, to be putting that animal cruelty imagery in front of people. And I do think that there's, I see too much sentiment that like somehow that's the wrong thing to do and it's going to put people off and everything. No, I think it's really important. And Jacob's right about this. Price, taste, convenience equivalence won't get us there alone. Because if people don't feel that they have a compelling reason to change the current thing that they're doing, they didn't even notice that the other thing is just as cheap, right? So that's the thing on messaging. And then the second thing, the last thing I'll say in terms of direction, on alt proteins, I worry that maybe we are getting too health concerned. Obviously, the ultra-processed foods has been a big talking point in the last couple of years, and I do think that that has hurt us to some extent. But I think that if producers... So you've seen, for example, Beyond Meat coming out with like this sun burger, and it's meant to be this is just like vegetables put together. First of all, they're still going to count as ultra-processed food, so it's not going to actually escape that category. If it is the case that it's healthier but worse tasting, I haven't had this, but it might be lovely. But to the extent that you're kind of making trade-offs when you're developing products, right? We can either make it a little bit healthier or a little bit tastier. I think that the tasty one's going to outsell the healthy one every time. People say that they want healthy food, but taste, really is, in all of the surveys I've seen where it's kind of people's self-reported importance of food choice factors, taste is always number one, or very nearly always number one, and price is very often number two, sometimes number three. Health is the third one in there. So it certainly is important for some consumers. It seems to be like a subset of consumers that are concerned about health, and some people it just doesn't register. The last point on that health, healthy alt proteins messaging, to be quite wary of when marketing products. Consumers often read healthy as not very tasty, right? Think about all the health-based labels that you might see: low fat, low salt, low sugar, diet. They don't sound very tasty, do they? Right? Give me the salty, fatty sugar, right? So, and there's some great studies that show this. When vegetarian options are offered, you can increase their selection by giving them some sort of indulgent label, smoky, whatever, like a flavor-based thing. But if you give them a healthy-based label, it actually decreases their selection compared to just having no label at all. So the health topic in general, I think we have to be quite careful. I do think taste is more important than health for most people. And second to that, health is sometimes signaling not tasty to consumers. So that was the point on alt proteins. And then, yeah, on messaging, just don't be afraid to use the animal messaging.
Yeah. Jacob?
I'll totally echo Chris's point of like, don't be afraid to use animal messaging. And in general, we need to message. I think that's an important failing of the PTC view on the issue is, yeah, it's just going to be market forces, just let the product speak for itself, yada, yada. No, people need to be motivated. It's sort of a truism in behavioral sciences. You need means and motives, right? So like a plant-based meat might be a means, but then you need a motive. And it's important that we motivate people. And I think there's also some sociological research to this effect across sort of technological transitions, is that sure, the technology is good, have the technology, but keep beating people over the head with the message of like, you need to use this technology for these reasons. Like, you need to do this, and this is why. So I think we should not be afraid to message. I do think we need to be nuanced about who does the messaging, right? Like, should it be an NGO? Should it be the companies themselves? I think we should be careful and thoughtful about that to make sure we have the right messenger sending that message, but nonetheless, still important to message. Next, I think we need to think on taste a bit more. As I alluded to, like actually operationalizing, which is to say getting down to the nuts and bolts of how would we know if two things were taste equivalent, it's kind of complicated, and there's lots of ins and outs of this. But one like very high level view that I've developed is a lot of the time we focus on blinded taste tests, so where people don't know whether they're eating the plant-based or the animal-based meat. And the idea here is that like we would make a plant-based meat that is indistinguishable in a blinded taste test from animal-based meat. And then the logic sort of follows of, okay, and at that point, how could they argue? They taste the same. You can't even tell the difference in a blinded taste test. And I think this sort of assumes like a bit of rationality that's a bit too generous for the world at large. And instead, we might want to consider unblinded taste tests, where we're telling people, this is an Impossible Burger, what do you think? Because that's the bar we need to pass, right? No one goes to Burger King. Well, Burger King's a bad example. They did run a blinded thing for a minute. But in general, these products are not being sold blinded, and it's illegal in most places not to disclose like the food ingredients that you're selling. So it's not really on the table that they're not sold. They're going to be unblinded. Everyone's going to know what they're eating. And this is also possibly an opportunity for us, where the bar of passing a blinded taste test might just be higher than passing an unblinded taste test. And instead of trying to make the burger that tastes exactly like a McDonald's McWhopper or whatever they're called, we can just make a burger that people like to eat. And maybe it doesn't taste exactly like a beef burger, but this could be to our advantage. And instead of being in sort of an uncanny valley of like, it tastes kind of like a beef burger, but it's not quite like it, we can just kind of do our own thing and make a product that's desirable because it tastes good in its own way. And more generally, I do think we focus a bit too much on alt proteins and this idea that we're going to give people exactly the same thing that they're eating before and get them to eat this other thing. This sort of sets us up for failure a little bit in some ways, and sets us up of like, we're trying to beat out that other burger. And we might also want to consider, in addition to having these plant-based meat burgers around, which some people are going to want, keep the veggie burgers around. Keep the other traditional plant-based foods around. If you scour the globe, American cuisine, very meat-heavy. But around the world, the rest of the cuisine is not that meat-heavy, and there's lots of plant-based foods that we can promote that are familiar to people, that don't read like Frankenfood, ultra-processed, whatever. And to be clear, I totally agree with like Chris on ultra-processed is just a silly marketing term, and what matters is like what's in the food itself, not how it's made. But we should expand our remit and not just focus on products that are analogous to meat products, but making sure that we're making plant-based foods available, because there are going to be different sectors of people who want those analogs, but other people who they want to eat beans or they want to eat more traditional, familiar foods. So we shouldn't overlook that. Last point I'll make is on reaching out to young people, especially. I think there's an opportunity to be had in some colleges and universities and even lower secondary, primary education, where there are plant-based options available, and where we can get in classrooms and do this sort of education. And that's, again, combining the means and the message. And I work in the US, so I know more about the US system than other places. But for example, the US has a lot of existing humane education where people are going into classrooms and teaching children, about the basics of animals and why you don't yank on a cat's tail, that sort of thing. But this is an opportunity, and there are some organizations taking advantage of this opportunity to do more in-classroom education about factory farming, why it's bad, the food system, climate change, all that sort of thing. And that's a good opportunity for us to combine the means and the message in an audience that is especially susceptible, right? Children are very empathetic towards animals. Speciesism only begins to develop once children are like 9 or 10. And then similarly, young adults, people in their late teens and early 20s, this is their first opportunity oftentimes to make agentic food choices, make their own choice instead of mom and dad or at school picking their food for them. They can go to the grocery store and buy their own groceries, and they have a long runway ahead of time. They have their whole life ahead of them where they'll be making those choices, and they are partially ingrained in that early adulthood. So these are two demographics that are being really critical to target, and we have access to sometimes, and are in good sort of choice environments where they might have access to plant-based foods prepared for them, like at a cafeteria.
Great. For listening to all of you, I think for me the biggest fear I have related to our plant-based theories of change is that there is just so much stuff that is not measurable, not directly measurable, and we just don't know the long-term effects. And with that, we might either work on something that's ineffective for a long time, or we might quit an intervention that might have proven very effective, but we just didn't give it a chance. And I'm wondering, what do you think about the role of plant-based advocacy in the entire scope of animal rights advocacy? Do you think it is possible to achieve animal liberation without plant-based work? Or what do you think about it?
I think it's much, much harder. Realistically, people are making their food choices, and if there is only very limited choices of what to eat otherwise, if you're not eating animal products, it's obviously harder to get people to do that. I agree. The point about taste is an interesting one, because when I looked into this, when I was writing my response to your piece, Jacob, I was looking at, okay, how does taste get measured in these kind of studies and so on? And there's really there's no objective measure, is there? If I love pickles and you hate pickles, one of us is not wrong, right? It is, taste is...
Au contraire.
Right, there's no accounting for taste, right? But at the same time, if we had some data that actually 99% of people hate pickles and only 1% of people like pickles, it might not be a good idea to start a pickle company, right? So it can appeal to this kind of intersubjective, they're not necessarily objectively right, but most people seem to prefer the taste of this over that. And there's some cool studies already. Impossible has defeated beef burgers in both blind and unblinded taste tests, which is pretty cool. So we've got some products that, in some categories at least, that we're very much getting there already. And I think there was this Nectar paper of the taste of different plant-based meats. I think I said we're there with chicken nuggets as well. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the second or third study on chicken nuggets that suggests that. Although I will say this, like another point I've changed my mind on a little bit. Like I think when I first wrote the first draft of the PTC paper, I was more confident that there are some products that are reaching some threshold of equivalence. But as you said, the equivalence threshold, I think this like feels like a very pedantic point of like, what does taste equivalence mean anyway? But then push comes to shove, if we're trying to test our theory, we need to be able to answer that question of have we achieved taste equivalence? And it's just quite nuanced, as you said.
I think you're right in the sense that like equivalence is probably leading us astray because there wouldn't be any. You could never show that it tasted exactly the same as meat. Is that true?
You could do like a blinded
okay, if there was
head-to-head.
yes, yeah, okay, you could. But the real important thing is rate of preference, right? If it's like 50% of people prefer this, so yeah, I think that's equivalence might be leading us astray there. But to your point
Totally
about
agree.
like how plant-based interacts with animal advocacy, I think this thing about push and pull factors is super important. And here's the thing for NGO people in the room: plant-based meat companies can't really be the ones to be doing the push messaging. Beyond Meat don't really want to have their logo on like the factory farming poster or something like that, right? Even though they're saying we're the solution to this problem that we're showing you, it's just not. It's not good vibes, right? So, in my view, that can't really be coming from the plant-based companies. Also, people are I won't go into that. So it needs to be the non-profits doing the push messaging, and don't be scared of showing the animal messaging. I know that you all aren't, but to tell other people that when you hear them, when you hear that pushback, and yeah, like Jacob said, to get out there to message, to be pushing people in the direction of alternatives. In theory, these things should both make it easier for each other. So don't get the idea that like alternative proteins is sort of a competition to traditional animal advocacy. No, they're going to work together. If there's better alternative proteins, animal advocacy becomes easier. And if there's more animal advocacy, selling alternative proteins becomes easier. They have to work together in this sort of stepped, synergistic way. So alt proteins and animal advocacy, I think, push and pull factors, both really, really important.
We have like last few minutes, and I just got the right tablet to see the questions because on my last one I was like, nobody's asking questions, and it's untrue. so let me like try one or two. If farmers are repeatedly a factor of our approaches not reaching acceptance in society, what solutions do you see regarding that obstacle? Are there any plant-based topics where we could win farmers' approval?
The big thing for me, the drop in farming jobs has been because of factory farms, not because of alternative proteins. The factory farmers have farted and they're pointing at alternative proteins and holding their nose, right? This is what's caused the loss of farming jobs in Europe, intensification. We're eating more meat than ever and we have fewer farming jobs than ever. So that is what's going on with the farmers. It's a completely misleading point that it's the vegan stuff killing the farmers. So the thing on our website is called it must be called like how the farm lobby distracts farmers and destroys their jobs. They're very much like shifting the blame onto alt proteins and not to do with that at all. That said, like as Jake said, the reality is not as important as people's beliefs when it comes to their political inclinations. And so I think that there are things that we can do to give some help to farmers. Canada had this really cool policy, which I'm always talking about in my policy role. They gave a substantial public investment to a plant-based meat company on the condition that they would source all of their ingredients from Canadian farmers. So that was a policy that was really, really beneficial for the plant-based industry, and the farmers were happy about that as well. So that's the kind of thing that we can look at doing, certainly in the short term.
I'd also add that there's sometimes an opportunity to divide farmers amongst themselves, which is to say pit small farmers against big farmers to the same point. And I think this is a real validation for moderate messaging sometimes, where if you say, oh yeah, we're going to get rid of all animal farms, like animal liberation now, that you have effectively unified your opponent, right? And said, okay, great, animal liberation now, they hate all of us, be it like a dairy farmer who has 20 cows or 20,000 cows. Where you say, oh, we oppose factory farming. Sure, we all want animal liberation, but we're just going to talk about factory farming and how 20,000 cows is bad, 20 is fine. All of a sudden we've divided our opponent, and that's to our benefit. So we should be willing to go with a message that's maybe more moderate than what we genuinely believe, or whatever strategic, but we should consider being strategic in our messaging.
Do you have?
Yeah, very quick. We got the agricultural ministry, like the governmental office, this year of Chile to be 50% plant-based by 2025. And one thing that we did with them is that something like at what Chris said. They are going to source themselves with the same farmers that they work on. Like they work all the time with farmers, so it was like very controversial, but we solve it that way. So they are going to, like, all the legumes and everything, they are sourcing from their own farmers.
Great. And the last question. UK and Germany had seen drops in meat consumption over the last couple of years. Have any of you examined what were the main factors driving the change in those countries? So can we replicate that?
Yeah, so I think this is like a very interesting case study and good opportunity for me to make a point I wanted to make anyway, which is about the small-bodied animal problem, which is this issue where people often shift from eating larger animals like cows and pigs to eating smaller animals like chicken and fish, which in practice means they harm hundreds or thousands of times more animals. My impression is roughly that this has been the case in Germany. I don't know for the UK specifically, but we need to be really cautious in what we hold up as success, because if that's the case, perhaps in some sense this is success. There's some speculative sense that maybe that's a transition period, right? And people go, they get rid of cows and pigs, and then they eat more chicken and fish, which is very, very bad for animals. But eventually that'll lead them to stop eating chicken and fish as well. But that is speculative, and the research on this is really limited. Like the study that Chris and I were discussing earlier is like one of the very few pieces of research that even has the opportunity to address this question. So I'm not 100% sure that that's actually what we want to replicate. And we need to be aware that, to the extent that that has happened, and to the extent that animal advocacy has been successful, quote unquote, in facilitating that change, possibly causing harm there. In terms of trying to divine what factors cause these national level trends, sort of as I alluded to earlier in observational studies, really difficult to do. Probably comes down to, broadly speaking, something like having lots of plant-based options available and having lots of motivating messaging. So recurring theme here.
Yeah. I would say that's a good point to have in mind when talking about the plant-based slowdown, particularly in the UK. We've been able to say, okay, plant-based consumption has been down somewhat in the last couple of years, whatever percentage it is. But actually, there's been a big decrease in meat consumption during that time as well, right? So that means that we are able to make the case maybe this isn't plant-based specific, and it's kind of to do with the broader economic slowdown. People are eating less meat as well. That said, yeah, Jacob's absolutely right that it has been story of decreasing red meat and increasing white meat, which is not good. I probably am one of these people who thinks that's like a necessary step along the road. It will get worse before it gets better in some sense for animals, because I've seen this sort of hierarchy of reduction where red meat tends to be the first thing to go, and then poultry, and then fish and eggs and dairy, kind of in some order after that. And that seems to be the same societally. So we're reducing meat consumption broadly. In some way along the road, we are actually eating more animals because more of our meat is coming from small animals. But I do think it's a positive trend nonetheless. And there's a great thing on our website, bryantresearch.co.uk. It's called the UK Protein Transition in 4 Graphs. And that is some good hopium for those of you who need it, of showing kind of the positive movement of plant-based meats and of veganism and so on in the last few years. That's called the UK Protein Transition in 4 Graphs.
Ignacia, would you like to add something?
Yeah, well, my field is Latin America, and we still see in many countries rising their meat consumption every year. But one thing that I think must be linked, I don't have any data on it, but probably the UK and Germany are places where they have the most alternatives, like plant-based alternatives. They also have a huge certification group of products, like certificated vegan, so it's easy to choose. And yeah, I think somehow it must be linked. I don't have the data, of course, but those are things that we are trying to implement in Latin America, and also to measure to see if they have any kind of implicances in the meat sector.
Great. So thank you all. We've run out of time. It was an inspiring exchange of views. So thank you all. Give the panelists a round of applause. And thank you, the audience, for being here with us and for listening. I'm sure that if you have questions, they are open to answering them like after.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you all for coming.